Welcome to this IUN Community Garden Session, Introduction to Perennial Flower Gardening. Our presenter today is Dolly Foster. Dolly, a landscape horticulturalist, has been a master gardener for 22 years, an Indiana Accredited Horticulturist for 20, and a certified arborist since 2008. For the past 22 years, Dolly has been presenting lectures on many garden topics. She spent several years as an adjunct faculty member in the Joliet Junior College Agriculture Horticulture Department and 18 years in the Parks and Recreation industry as staff horticulturist for 2 park districts. Dolly also managed the Oak Lawn Community Garden. Dolly has been butterfly gardening from the very beginning of her garden career. Her passion has led her to raising monarch and swallowtail butterflies, which she has done for the past 15 years. Her garden at home has been a monarch way station since 2011. Welcome, Dolly. We're very glad to have you with us today.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm really glad to be here today. Okay, everybody, welcome. We are going to talk about the basics of perennial gardening today. And this is a really, really big topic with a lot of different places that we can go. I tried to bring this down to just a few concepts to cover. We only have an hour, so, it's going to be very fast-paced. I don't have a handout for this lecture, so make sure that you ask your questions. You can take pictures of my slides, as long as you do not turn around and use those slides in any other lectures or presentations. I would appreciate that. But for your own use, you're welcome to take photos of my slides. And let's get started. So this is a photograph of my garden at home. This is kind of my main garden. I call it my West garden. It is a mixture of natives and just regular perennials, a lot of stuff for wildlife, and we're going to address all that today. But I just wanted to let you know that this garden is the culmination of about 22 years of gardening. So this garden has taken a long time to develop, and it has also taken a lot of different forms. That it has been completely non-native, it has been a little bit native, it's a lot native now. So it's gone through a lot of evolution. And one of the reasons why I got into gardening was because I liked it when I was a kid. I really liked plants when I was a little girl. And I liked doing things out in the garden with my parents, although that usually ended up with me planting 12 flats of begonias every spring for my mother. That was about the extent of my gardening when I was a kid. So it just kind of evolved when I was an adult. It was a great way to work through my grief after my mother died. It was a really big part of that. So gardening is really, really good for your health in a lot of different ways, but especially emotionally. So let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to go over some basic concepts. Before you dive into perennial gardening, if you are going to start a new garden from scratch, I think that as you do your research and you're doing readings and you're looking at things about perennial gardening, you're going to run to a lot of concepts, a lot of terms that are really popular out there right now. Landscaping for sustainability or sustainable landscaping you're going to run into. Living in harmony with nature is another concept. Feeding or gardening for wildlife is big right now. Building ecosystems, that's another term. Native landscaping, natural landscaping, that's a term that will come up. And replacing the lawn. So we're not going to go into all of these concepts, but what I want to say about these is that they are all basically saying the same thing, and that is start a garden indeed. Start a garden and make sure part of that garden has native plants, because we want to accommodate wildlife. We want to support nature. We want to support insects. We want to support native birds. And we want to build an ecosystem in our soil that will make our garden healthy and that will make the environment healthy. And that's kind of what all those concepts are focused on in a little bit different way, each one of those. So it's, so these are concepts that you're going to come across. But let's talk about what happens when you start a garden from the very, very first. You want to not only stand outside and look at your garden or look at your potential garden and decide how big it's going to be, decide what you want to do. Is it west facing? Is it south facing? How much sun will it get? Is it going to be a shade garden? You want to be outside and look at all those things and take all those things into consideration along with the other concepts I just introduced briefly. But also, I would like you to go inside your house and stand by your windows where your garden is going to be and see what you are going to see from the inside of your house. How is your garden going to impact your view from the inside? And not only that, can you sit at your breakfast table and look out at the garden? Can you see hummingbirds and butterflies from your dinner table? Those kind of things. Consider that. And then the other thing I want you to think about is, what are your visitors to your garden going to see first when they come? Are they going to enter through a gate into your backyard? And what's going to be the first view that they are going to see? What's the first view you're going to see every day when you go through that gate? At the end of the day, after work's been a terrible day, it's been really hard. I want to just walk through the gate of my backyard into this garden, and I want it to be beautiful. And what is the first thing I want to see? So those are just a few things to think about when you are starting out. And don't forget about putting in little surprises. If you have a blind corner in your yard, or your pathway to your backyard or your front yard, goes around a corner, or does it weave? Is it curved? Are you going to have little surprises here and there so that when you or your visitors are walking around your garden, what kind of little surprises are they going to see here and there? Could be a piece of art, could be a special plant, could be anything like that. Anything that you think is really, really cool. I have lots of things in my garden like that. I have a lot of small garden art. So let's talk about something that happened last fall. The new USDA hardiness maps came out. This is the map of Indiana, and I just kind of have the whole United States map peeking out from the back here. You can Google USDA plant hardiness zone map. It's really easy to find, but I wanted to focus in on the Indiana map because if you look up here in the top left corner of our state where we are in Lake County, where I'm sure most of you viewers are, you can see that Lake County is now mostly, or half, zone 6A. So we have moved up a half zone. We used to only have zone 6A right on the immediacy of the lake, by Lake Michigan, because Lake Michigan affects our weather and our climate. And now, because of climate change, we have gone up a half zone. So you can see that right down around Crown Point is still, it's on the edge of zone 6A and 5B. And then south of Crown Point is still 5B, 5B. So there's still like a cold pocket in our state, and that is up here in the northwest part, but closer to the lake, we're all zone 6B. So this is going to affect you. I know that you have all noticed that this spring is 3 weeks early. I had tulips that were coming out right after my birthday on March 12th. That is completely unheard of. Or daffodils on my birthday is completely unheard of. The magnolia tree across the street from me was blooming right after my birthday, completely anomalous. So keep in mind that this is going to, in the future, give you a chance to plant some different plants. It means that our last frost is going to be later into October. I believe it's like October 30th now. And then our first frost, is going to be later in October. And our last frost is now April 30th instead of May 15th. And thinking back on it, our last frost was somewhere around April 24th or 25th. It was like a week and a half ago. So things are changing, and I just want you to to notice that. So what it has given us this year is a really, really long spring, which is great, except for the soil not being warmed up. So you can't put things out yet. So don't plant your tomatoes yet. The soil is not warmed up enough. If the soil is not warmed up enough, any annuals or vegetables that you put in the garden too soon are going to be stunted. So I just wanted to make that point. That we're a zone warmer, but the soil doesn't warm up as fast as you think it does. So let's move into soil fundamentals. So before you start a garden, or as you are developing a new-ish garden, make sure that you know what kind of soil you're growing in. That is very important because it is going to sort of dictate what plants you can grow. You are not going to be able to grow certain things that naturally grow in sandy soil. You are not going to be able to grow in clay soil. So soil itself is composed of minerals, which is sand, silt, and clay, and then air, water, and organic matter. And believe it or not, like air and water take up about 50% of the space in soil. So soil, air and water in the soil is very, very important. So clay soil itself, all by itself, can be really thick. It can be hard. It can be wet. It's really difficult to dig into sometimes. When I first started growing plants, my backyard where my patio is right now, where I have a patio, before when I was starting to garden, I was gardening in that area first, and it was absolutely unbelievable. They brought clay fill in, I think, but also I live about 300 yards away from a river, so I have a lot of clay because of that. So, you know, like my boots were coming off in my garden because the clay was so thick and it was so sticky. Planting was absolutely ridiculous. I was like banking my plants with pieces of clay and hoping they would live. When I first started gardening, I didn't even know how to plant a hole or dig a hole when I first started gardening. And starting to garden in clay is quite possibly the worst case scenario. So clay is thick, it's wet, it's gross. Sometimes it smells bad if it's retaining too much water. Loamy soil is probably the most desired soil. It's loose, it's well drained, it holds water just right. Sandy soil is very loose, it drains fast, it doesn't hold on to a lot of nutrients or water. So unless you have plants that are specifically adapted just for soil that is sandy, then you're probably going to have a not very fun experience also. So what happens with soil in gardens, though, is that you can have any combination of all these three. You can have clay loam, you can have sandy loam, and every degree in between. So you can figure out, if you can figure out what you have, and you can do a jar test. If you Google a soil jar test, that will give you the directions on how to do a little soil test at your house, so you can see if your soil is mostly clay, is it mostly sand, is it loam, and how much organic matter it has. It's a really simple test, but because of time, we're not going to talk about that today. But you can explore that on your own. A little bit more about soil. If you are going to head on to gardening in the soil that you have, the native soil that you have, if you have clay or any other combination of clay, look for native plants that are called clay busters. You can Google that term. And these are great plants that have very, very deep roots. They don't mind the clay. Their roots actually mine their way through the clay. I'm going to show you an illustration of that. Next, loamy, you can grow nearly everything. If your soil is well drained, you're going to be able to grow almost anything. Sandy soil is so dry and it drains so fast. Again, you're going to have to look for special plants, but we'll talk about how to fix that in a second. But what I wanted to show you next was an illustration that has been floating around for about 30 years in the native plant world. And this is an illustration of how deep all of these species of native plants roots go. So if you look in the center of the illustration to the very, very far left, that little tiny tuft on the far left is turf grass. Turf grass roots go down in the average yard about 4 inches and not much more. In a golf course, they do special things. They can get grass roots to go 10, 12 inches, but they do special things to it. But if you notice all these other plants in this illustration, these roots are really, really deep. Lead plant, which is one of the plants I have in my garden, look at the measurement for that, goes down to 14 feet. Compass plant, which I also have in my garden, goes down 15 feet. Cylindric blazing star over on the far right, that little purple plant, the second one in. It's a really tiny little plant, isn't it? But look at the extensive roots that this plant has. So what happens, these plants grow these big, enormous roots every summer, and they create channels in the soil. And in the wintertime, those roots die back up to the main plant. And then the channels are left in the soil for water and air to move around the soil. So it's really a wonderful adaptation and for conserving water. But also another reason why prairie plants have this big, long roots is for prairie fires. And so a prairie fire is a totally natural phenomenon. It's been happening for thousands and thousands of years on the prairies. We need them. Plant seeds need them to be able to burst open and germinate. And then these plants also need the nutrients that are left behind in the ash of the plants. So it's a pretty cool system. And a lot of these plants, in fact, most of these plants I have in my garden, heath aster, compass grass, goldenrod, big blue stem. I don't have pale purple coneflower, prairie dropseed, side oats grama, white wild indigo. I have a little bit of almost all of these. So what this does for your garden is that it improves the soil over time. I hope that's clear. Okay, so if you want to change or amend your soil, then the one thing that you need for both fixing clay soil, improving clay soil or improving sandy soil is compost, organic matter. That's what you need for both of those problems, if you consider them a problem. So think about adding mushroom compost to your garden. Think about making your own compost, adding chicken manure, duck manure, sheep manure, those kinds of things. Mulch, hardwood mulch over time, or wood chips will decay over time. That will improve your soil greatly. You can leave the leaves every fall in your garden unless they are poplar leaves, like big cottonwood leaves. And what's the other one that you don't want to leave? Silver maple. Silver maple and cottonwood leaves don't decay over 1 year, and sometimes oak leaves don't either. So you don't want to leave those in great numbers or depth in your garden because it will smother your plants. In that case, you can move your leaves out of your garden. You can chop them up. There's a lot of different ways you can chop up your leaves and then throw them back on your yard, throw them back on your garden. So in that way, you are going to then increase your population of decomposing insects, and the decomposing insects are what make compost. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. So that's why I have this this little illustration here, is that all of these insects are very, very important. And all the ones on the bottom half of the illustration are insects that live, all the creepy crawlies live in the ground, and these guys work on decomposing organic matter in the garden. And what they leave behind is new, very rich compost and soil. So really consider your decomposers as your friend. As you're digging through the garden and you're seeing worms and you're seeing little beetles and you're seeing grubs, not every single grub in your garden is going, in fact, no grubs in your garden are going to be Japanese beetles, if you know about that problem. Japanese beetle grubs only live in turf. And if you don't have turf and you see a grub, it is some sort of beneficial beetle that is there to do the decomposing. So it's an important distinction to remember. Some favorite garden tools that I have. These are probably the 3 most used garden tools in my garden. On the top left is a soil knife, or a hori-hori. My soil knife, I buy them with the very, very sharp edge. I can use them for weeding, for mixing soil, for planting. dividing perennials. I can use them for measuring depth because it has a little ruler on it. There's a lot of different ways that you can use this tool. But when I was working in the park districts, this was the only tool that I gave my workers. And I had a collection of like fancy duct tapes, and they would all decorate their own tool so they wouldn't lose it. So it was a good way for them to keep track of them. But this was a great tool because they could cut little stems with them. I didn't need to give everybody a pair of pruners that was going to get lost, and they could use it for almost everything that they needed for their job. So it's a wonderful tool. Next to that is a floral shovel. This is not a full-size pointed shovel. A floral shovel is about half the width in the blade as a regular big pointed shovel, and it's good to use around a perennial garden where things are close together and you're trying to get a plant out, or you're trying to dig a hole and you don't have a lot of space. This is a really good shovel because it makes a small hole and you can get in tight places with it. And then the pruners on the bottom are something called a Felco 13. Felco is an old company from Switzerland that makes probably the best pruning tools in the world. Every single piece on that pair of pruners is replaceable. So these could be the last set of pruners you buy for your entire life, and you only have to buy a new blade every about 5 years. Sometimes you'll lose a nut, you can get a replacement nut, that kind of thing. So fully replaceable, the pieces are available when you need a new replacement piece. It's great. The reason why I like this specific size of Felco, there's a lot of different ones out there. I like this one because of the long handle, because this makes it easier to get some leverage, and you can cut up to a 1.5-inch tree branch or shrub branch with this tool. So you can cut flowers, you can do your weeding with it, you can cut weeds, you can do all kinds of pruning with this. And the advantage is you don't have to get out your big long pruners until you have 1.5 or more diameter branches that you have to cut. So it's a really versatile pair of pruners, and they're very comfortable to use. All right, let's move on to planting. That's what we're all here for, right? When can you start a perennial garden? You can start a perennial garden and plant a perennial garden anytime that you can work the soil. So I'd say that's anytime between May 1st and the beginning of October. You kind of have to think about at the end of the season, how long will those plants have time to put down some new roots? But anytime after May, because perennials can take that cold soil temperature, whereas annuals and vegetables really can't. So anytime that you can work the soil for the most part, what I don't want you to think as new gardeners or teaching a new gardener is that the only time that you can plant a perennial is in the spring before the end of June or whatever. You can plant anytime during the season as long as you can get water to that plant. So I have planted perennials numerous times, and I've done planting projects in my job numerous times in July and at the beginning of August in our driest, hottest period. But if you can get water to those plants every day for at least 2 to 3 weeks, that planting is going to be fine. So water is the key for that. Everybody who is a gardener loves planting between May and the end of June, because usually it's raining pretty frequently and we don't have to pay attention to watering quite as meticulously as if we are planting a perennial garden in July or the beginning of August, because right around the middle of August, the weather changes a little bit and we start getting more rain. So, but I just want you to be aware of the fact that if anybody tells you you can't plant perennials in the middle of the summer, you can just tell them that they're not informed, and you are. So another thing about putting plants in the garden is learn how to dig a hole. And again, I did not know how to dig a hole when I first started gardening. It was before I became a master gardener. Not that master gardener class taught us how to dig a hole, because they did not. But make sure that you know to dig a hole the proper size. I'd say one of the things that kills perennials more than others is if they are too deep. So this is a great little illustration from Garden Gate magazine. And Garden Gate magazine is a wonderful magazine to get a subscription to. Explore their website if you're a brand new gardener because they have such wonderful illustrations and information. So what they're trying to illustrate here is that when you plant a hole for a perennial, it does not have to be this wide, but it does not also have to be as deep as you think. It is better, especially in thick, wet soil, to raise up the crown of your plant just above the soil line. So the crown of the plant is where, I hope you guys can see my arrow. The crown of a plant is where the leaves and the roots come together. The tissue in between the leaves and the roots, the stems and the roots, is the crown tissue. The crown tissue sends roots down, sends stems up, creates the flowers. And it is better to have that a little bit, above the soil line and then mulch around it. In Germany, they do this all the time where they plant their perennials. Not that you guys are probably going to do this, but it's kind of an interesting fact. They plant their perennials where their perennials are about an inch above ground, the crown of the plants, and then they put gravel around it. It's really cool. It drains well. Most of the time, a perennial is going to die because the crown is too deep, stays too wet too long, and then just rots. So just make sure that you are not planting your plants too deep. Test it while the plant is still in the pot to make sure that your hole is big enough and deep enough. And then when you are designing, now I'm not going to talk about design at all today because that is a totally different topic. But when you are getting ready to put all of your plants in the garden, make sure that you lay them all out first. If you're planting a totally new garden and you have all the plants at one time, lay them out first, make sure that they go where you want them to go, play around with the arrangement, make sure short plants in the front, middle plants in the middle, and the tall plants in the back, because you don't want to put something like a hollyhock in front of a peony, because you won't be able to see the peony. So lay them all out first before you plant, and then you can start digging holes. All right. And then mulch after you plant. Now, I feel mulch is really important until your garden grows in and grows together. If you're planting native plants, you're going to have native plants reseeding, and that's a good thing. You want your plants to be tight. You want your plants to become a community. Native grasses are often part of that equation. And what that does is those native plants and the grasses that have really, really big root systems, they are going to create competition for weeds. So the first year or two, you're going to need mulch until everything starts to mature and grow together. And so mulch helps keep the soil cool during the hot weather, keeps the soil warm during the winter, keeps things from popping out of the soil in the winter. And then it keeps the weeds down, but only the weed seedlings. It's really important to understand that when you are mulching a garden, if you have some kind of perennial weed in your garden, like, for example, Canadian thistle, which unfortunately I have in my garden, if you have a perennial weed like that, that spreads by roots, comes back every year, that is not going to be prevented by weeds. The only weeds that mulch is going to prevent are the ones that start from seed. So that's an important fact to really get into your head. When you mulch, do not mulch directly around the base of your plant here at the crown, at the soil level. You don't want mulch touching there because you do not want this area of the plant to stay wet because it will rot. Okay? All right, so I hope that's clear. So let's talk about some after planting care. Wow, that's a lot of print. That's a lot of text. Okay, so let's look at the picture first. This is a plant that is going through transplant shock. It happens to a lot of plants when you first plant them, especially if we're planting in hot weather. So it's important to do one thing before you plant, very important. Water all of your plants before you put them in the ground. Try not to ever put a plant in the ground from a pot into the ground that is completely dry, because that plant will wilt. It'll look just like this guy. This guy looks really, really sad. I think it's like a little maple tree or something. But perennials will go through transplant shock also. And this is what they'll look like. They'll just wilt. And then you'll think that you killed it, but you didn't kill it. You just put it in too dry. So make sure that you water for what the plant needs. And usually if it's like hot weather, we're not getting rain in 2 or 3 days or a week, you're going to water every day. If we have a cool day where it's like 75 degrees, it's a little overcast, we're not going to get rain, you may not have to water on a day like that. If it's going to be 100 degrees for 3 days in a row, expect that you are going to water your perennials probably twice during that 3-day time period. All right, so watering is extremely important in a garden. And again, another plug for native plants. Native plants can usually sail through that kind of really, really hot weather without too much care, unless they have been freshly planted. If they are freshly planted, they are going to need aftercare. They're going to need water. So if after a couple of weeks your plant is not recovering, or even probably after a week, if your plant is not recovering from this state, then you have probably overwatered it and you should stop watering. And be aware that with plants, even like with this little maple, once a leaf has been damaged, if you see on this picture, the leaves over on the right side are a little bit crispy. Once a leaf has been damaged, that damage can't be fixed, but the plant will put out new leaves, okay? So plant tissue is not like mammal tissue. We can make new tissue and we can heal, but plants can't do that. What they will do is put out a new leaf, they'll put out a new stem. So if your plant is wilting and it looks like it's dead after you've planted it, you've watered it, you think you overwatered it, leave it alone. The top of that plant may die, but it may put up new stems if it's still healthy and the crown hasn't rotted. So you can dig around a little bit and make sure that it's not completely buried. They also might need a little bit of fertilizer, and make sure whenever you fertilize plants ever in your whole life, if it says 2 scoops of fertilizer for a 2-gallon watering can, make sure you're only putting 1 scoop or 3/4 of a scoop. Fertilizing less is more advantageous to your plant. If you fertilize your plant and you have too much fertilizer in the water, then the roots can burn. It can just destroy your plant, especially if it's way, way too much fertilizer. So always fertilize a little bit less than what you think the plant needs or what the directions say. You can always fertilize more frequently with less product. That is a more consistent feeding than just blasting your plant once right when it's planted with fertilizer. So wait a couple of days for the fertilizer. Only do it if you think the plant needs it, and do it diluted. But again, you can prevent transplant shock usually by watering your plants before you put them in the ground, and then plant on a cloudy day. If you can, plant late in the day when it's cooled off, things like that. You want to try and not stress your plants by planting first thing in the morning, or God forbid, right at noon. Nobody should be out in the sun at noon. A few tips and tricks for buying plants. If you're going to buy perennials, try not to buy perennials when they are in flower. So in flower means that the perennial plant has flowers on it the day that you buy it. And what happens is when you plant a plant into your garden when it is in flower, if that plant is going through transplant shock, which guaranteed it will if it's in flower, it will sacrifice its flowers. And then it will also try and put out more flowers, because its end goal, the end goal of every plant is to flower and reproduce. And so if the plant is going to put out more new flowers right away after it's been planted, then guess what it's not doing? It's not putting down new roots and making a foundation so the plant can live for years to come. So what I usually do if I buy a plant in flower, because I succumb to the temptation every year, is that I will put that plant somewhere where I can watch it and enjoy the flowers in my garden, around my garden, patio, where I keep my plants. And I will enjoy those flowers. And when the plant is done flowering, I will cut those flowers off and toss them into the compost and then plant the plant. Because usually perennials will flower only once during the season. And once they're done, they're done. And then they can go into the garden and they will put down roots instead of trying to struggle and put out more flowers and to make seeds. When you are becoming a perennial gardener, you don't have to worry about a late frost with perennials because they can take it. As you can see in this photo, I took this years and years ago, but I love this photo because it snowed the night before, and then this was kind of mid-morning when the snow was melting into the plants. The perennial plants can take cold. They can take a lot of cold, and they'll be okay. And if for some reason it gets way too cold and the leaves do get damaged, a perennial has enough energy in its roots to push out new leaves. Okay, so you don't have to cover them. But as a gardener, it is useful for you to have some frost cloth. Because if you're going to grow vegetables or you're growing annuals, you have bought all of your annuals and we're going to get hit with a frost, then it would be useful for you to have some frost cloth in your garage as one of your tools as a gardener. I made use of frost cloth this spring because we had some really weird, fluctuations in temperature. So you'll want to cover tender things, but perennials you absolutely do not have to cover in spring. Another thing that I find useful to know that I started doing years and years ago is keep every single plant tag. At least, if you buy 10 of a plant, you only need to keep one. But keep them for several years so that if you lose a plant that you really, really liked, you might want to replant it. And just because you lose a plant doesn't mean that that plant is bad. Every plant, just like every other being on earth, has a lifespan. So for perennials, it's going to be from 3 years to whenever. The longest lived perennial out there is probably peonies. They can live 100 years plus. Probably the shortest lived perennial that is pretty common is columbine, which is about 4 years. And then everything else is about 5 to 8 years, 5 to 9 years. So you're going to get several years out of your perennials, but something can happen and one plant dies or something like that, and you want to replace it with the same plant because you have a design or whatever. Keep your plant tags. I don't do anything as sophisticated as this, as putting them into a book. It looks like some kind of notebook. But what I do is just use a 1-gallon Ziploc bag for each year. And I just put the year on the bag and then I just keep the bags. And they're just kind of stowed in my office just in case I have to go back and find a tag for something. Don't put them in the garden because plant tags will deteriorate over time or get lost or get completely buried. You don't want to have to dig the plant up to be able to find the tag. So do keep the tags though, because I find that I've had many, many conversations over my life as a gardening educator where the person had a problem with a plant, wanted to replace a plant, and I have said, did you keep the tag? And usually the answer is no. So do get in the habit of that. It's a good habit. All right, next, let's talk briefly a little bit more about watering. So if you plant your plants close together, they will cover more soil, keeps the gardens cooler, and then you will have to water less. Plant short prairie grasses in between your perennials, like little blue stem, side oats grama, prairie dropseed. This is a really great way to make channels in your soil where water can go. Remember how those deep roots go. And then also this creates a really nice habitat because there are a lot of butterflies and other kinds of insects and birds that use native grasses for habitat and for food. And they are much more important than you think. Try not to water the foliage of your perennial plants every single day, like, putting on a big sprinkler. Try and water by hand if possible. If it's a really big area though, I would never expect you to try and do a big area like 1,200 square feet by hand. That's completely irrational to think that you would do that. But try not to get the foliage wet late in the day. Wet foliage going into night under the right circumstances will create fungal infections on the plant's leaves. And there's a number of different ones that are out there. Powdery mildew is probably the one that most people know of because it happens right around the middle of August when our weather changes. It gets a little bit more humid or a lot more humid. So water early in the morning if possible so that the plant can use the water that it's getting and so the leaves dry out. And that's really like, those are the basics of watering, and making sure that your brand new planting is watered very frequently, if not every day during a hot spell for the first 2 to 3 weeks. And then after that, you can taper off that watering and then decide how often your plants really need it. In my garden here, my 22, 24-year-old garden with lots and lots of natives in it, I really find that I am watering only when the temperatures get up in the high 80s and the 90s, and watering, for 20 minutes to a half an hour, sometimes a little bit longer, if it's going to be even hotter, just to get some water down in the soil. If you don't know this already, water follows water in the soil. So having the channels of those big roots is really important. Water goes down in those roots and it kind of stalls. Putting on a little bit more water will push it down deeper where it can be conserved, and then the plants can take it up when they need it. Okay, let's move on. I know I'm like touching on everything really briefly, so I hope this is helping you. So should you clean your garden up at the end of the season? My opinion is absolutely no. You don't need to do it unless you have peonies, zinnia, phlox, monarda, or any other plant that is prone to a leaf disease like powdery mildew. And if they have powdery mildew, then you should definitely clean those plants up at the end of the season. If you have the majority of your plants in your garden in natives, then it behooves you to leave them alone for the winter and for the late summer and allow native bees to make their home and lay eggs in those stems for the winter. In the springtime, you can do something called chop and drop. It gives you a little bit more organic matter on the floor of your garden, and it gives those insects somewhere to lay their eggs. So let's talk a little bit more about this, a little bit more intricately. So how this works with the native bees, and this absolutely blew my mind when I finally learned the whole story about it. A lot of gardening outlets out there for many, many years have been saying, don't cut your plants down at the end of the season. Okay, fine. When do the bees put their nests in the stems? Not this season. Those stems have to be there next year, dried out, standing in the garden, in order for the native bees to put their nests in there. And why is this important? Because we need those native bees. Those native bees are part of our environment. They are part of our ecosystem. They serve many, many different jobs in our ecosystem. Some of them are parasitic wasps. Some of them are really good pollinators. Some of them are food for hummingbirds. Some are food for other creatures. So it's really important that we have our 400 species of native bees actively in our area. You're never going to get all the species in one area because they like different plants and things like that. But I have about 20 species of bees in my garden that I have seen over the years. It's not all 20 every year. But they are really beautiful little creatures, and I like that I am giving them habitat. So what you have to do is, if you look at the illustration, in winter, you're going to leave the dead flower stalks intact. And this is a coneflower in this illustration. And so the coneflower heads, the flower heads, are useful to leave up anyway because the birds will eat the seeds. In the springtime, you cut down the flower stems somewhere between 8 and 24 inches tall. Usually I say 12 to 24 inches tall, because that is the widest part of the stem. You leave them up, they're dry, native bees can drill into them and lay their eggs in them this summer. Okay? They can't do that in a green stem. Not all of them, at least. You can see in the illustration how they stack their babies in the stems. They hollow the stem out and stack their babies up. Those are the things, the pollen and the little white thing are the babies. It's the yellow pollen, and then the little white thing on top is the egg. It kind of looks like a lemon. But for a bee to hollow out a live flower stem would kill the stem. And in the summertime, you are going to see new stems that are growing with new flowers, which will completely hide last year's stems. That fall and winter, the second fall and winter, you have flower stems from the second year that are there to feed the birds, and then the stems are just hanging out. In the third year, the second year stems will probably just fall and collapse, and they will become part of the garden, as will the flower stems when you cut them off and just drop them in the garden. They become part of the mulch. They are food for the decomposing insects in your garden, the earthworms, the beetles, all the other things that eat and decompose organic matter. And the adult bees come out that second spring. So I hope that's clear. Please put any questions you have about this in the chat, and we will talk about it. And what does it look like when a bee does this? This is what it looks like. You can see that the pith in the middle of the stem is kind of eaten away. And the bee has gone down in there and she has deposited a little ball of pollen and an egg, and then she seals it up with plant material and mud or mud, depending on the species. So I hope that's clear. Be friends with our bees. We need them. All right, so, and also, not doing a lot of garden cleanup is good for you. I have gone, since I started doing this a few years ago, I have gone from putting out like 12 to 14 or more paper bags out in the front of my house for the city to pick up, to take away, to probably about 3 or 4 bags per season, because everything just gets chopped and dropped in my garden. So it's a much easier way to garden and much more earth friendly. Now, a new trend that is out there for perennial gardeners is remove your lawn or not. There is a lot of conversation about this going on in the world. People are talking about clover lawns. People are talking about mixed lawns. People are talking about no lawn. Should you remove all of your lawn? Well, yes and no. I would say that if you have kids and if you have pets, you have to leave some lawn, because your kids and pets have needs of getting outside and playing. I mean, that's just a fact. And so you also don't have to remove all of it, because you might want a path through your yard to be able to see your gardening. What are the benefits of removing your lawn? Or why is a lawn bad? Lawns are really complicated because, let me see if I can find my notes. I can't find my notes here. Lawns take up enormous amounts of water that we don't need to be wasting on them. Lawns are expensive because you have to fertilize them, or you should fertilize them. They need fertilizer a couple times a year. And then what if you have crabgrass in the neighborhood? You might have to prevent the grass from getting totally destroyed by crabgrass. What if you have Japanese beetle grubs? Well, you're going to want to kill those. So it's very, very expensive and intensive to take care of a lawn, not to mention the mowing and the pollution that mowing is creating. So getting rid of some or part of your lawn could be beneficial. It could be a matter of just expanding your front landscaping. I'm going to show you in a picture in a minute. It could be completely getting rid of your lawn. Now, you may have trouble with your city. You may want to talk to your city councilman or your town councilman or trustees because you might need to know what the ordinances are. You don't want to get slapped with a fine. God forbid you live in an HOA. You should talk to the HOA, or better yet, take my very, very famous advice, get on the HOA board and vote the HOA out. It's happened. People do have big problems with HOAs, or work with your HOA and make pollinator gardening and pollinator landscaping a priority so that it is not all just boxwoods yews and crabapple trees. Okay, so let's move on. So leave some bare soil when you do this, either a transformation where you're taking out the lawn or you are putting in a big perennial garden. Leave some bare soil in some places so that you have somewhere where bumblebees and other ground nesting bees to have their nests. They can't dig through mulch. And I have a really nice bumblebee nest that is used year after year back in my patio. So the bees are my friends back there. So, and I've uncovered bees in the spring in my garden, like big bumblebees, the queen bumblebees. It's really cool. So you guys can take a picture of this and read it later. But definitely try and give shelter to ground nesting bees as well as stem nesting bees. Now, what does it look like to have no lawn in the front of your house? This is sometimes what it looks like. This is a really beautiful mixed garden. It is perennial natives and non-natives. It's advantageous to put a few shrubs in to give some structure during the winter. You can use rocks for some interest in the winter also, because they're probably going to get overgrown in the spring and summer. Make sure that if you are going to do this, register your garden with the National Wildlife Foundation or some other registry so that you can put a sign out, because that sign gives legitimacy to what you are doing, that you are gardening for the environment, you are gardening for wildlife, you are trying to conserve the environment, you are trying to build an ecosystem. And that sometimes goes really far with working with crabby neighbors who hate your weeds, to working with the city, to working with an HOA. So have it registered with, Monarch Way Stations, or, one of the other half dozen. Homegrown National Park is another one that's a really great organization to work with. I think that my garden has like 6 registries. So I pity the fool that fights against my garden, because they're not going to win. This is another little picture of what your front garden could look like if you have a small front garden. This person put in a false river. Kind of looks cool. I find that if you put too many rocks in a garden, though, like on an edge or like this, kind of takes away from looking at the plants. But this is obviously California, because you can see the red tiles up here in the wall. So these are like California plants. But what does it look like just to expand your front garden, your front landscaping? So from this photo, this is a photo from a drone, and the front landscaping originally was probably right here and goes around the house. I hope you guys can see my arrow. In front of this path, or behind this path, but in front of the path, they have put in 2 new planting areas that, again, this is like Florida, so these aren't really our plants, because I see sago ferns and big palm trees. But the same idea can be done with perennials and with native plants. You leave a little bit of clover lawn or something down here on the edge by the street, so there's no obstruction of view for drivers. That's really important for that will take you far with your ordinances for your city, so that you don't become an enemy of the city. You definitely don't want that. And then you can plant whatever you want on your lawn and create a habitat. So it doesn't have to look wild and crazy like the very first photo that I showed you. It can be a little bit more refined and organized, even with adding grasses, because I feel that just working in this industry for years and years and working with the public, that adding prairie grasses to a garden can be very divisive. People think that prairie grasses look really messy, and as soon as you put grasses into a garden, oh my God, you have a prairie and it looks like crap. So there's a lot of misconceptions about that, about how important prairie grasses are to a garden and to an environment, to the natural environment. But they are pretty important. And so if I had a really nice space like this, which I do, but there's reasons why I can't take away my entire garden or my entire lawn. I have geothermal, so I can't like break. It's sort of like having a septic system, but it's in my front lawn, so I can't really break into the turf. But I can expand my garden very, very slowly in certain places. Let's talk about adding native plants to your garden and why should you do it? Why did I get into native plants? I got into native plants because when I first started gardening, I was very, very determined that I was going to have a butterfly garden. Now, I went out and I bought gardening books and a garden book called Theme Gardens. And I think I bought every butterfly gardening book in the world. And none of those gardening books that talked about Midwest gardening, North America gardening, had native plants in the plant lists to attract our native butterflies. And I think that's a big problem. It's changed now. The industry has completely changed about how butterfly gardening and insect gardening is done in the North America now. The first thing that I realized was that I really wanted monarch butterflies, but I met someone from Wild Ones here in Hammond. I'm not even sure how I met the person, probably through Master Gardeners, but they're like, hey, you should join this organization. Wild Ones is really good for educating people on what monarch butterflies need and what bees need and things like that. So I started to get more interested, and I started planting things like swamp milkweed first and adding it to my regular conventional perennials. And then I started to phase out the other perennials, except for a few things, and then adding in more natives. And that was because I just felt like feeding the environment was so important. So they benefit wildlife greatly, and this includes above ground and below ground. There were a couple of things that really struck me about 10 years into this when I first really started collecting eggs for monarch butterflies. I was sitting out in the garden. I was like checking out what was going on, but digging in the garden in the spring, I was finding things like lightning bug larvae. I mean, have you ever seen the lightning bug larva? I freaked out when I saw this thing. Then I learned out what it was and how important they are and how valuable they are. I have crickets in my garden. Not a lot of people have crickets in my neighborhood because they don't have a tall garden. They like tall plants. I think I saw, I've seen a couple of different types of beetles. I've seen staghorn beetles in my garden before because I had a big mulch pile that I allowed to rot. There's just like all kinds of things that I found, and I just was really touched by that when I started to see that my garden was not just a garden anymore, but it became an ecosystem. And it happened pretty quickly. Like within 10 years, I started seeing specialized insects, extra bees, more butterflies, hummingbirds, things like that. So native plants definitely benefit wildlife. They're adapted to our region. And even if you wanted to plant a native plant that is not strictly from our region, but somewhere adjacent, that's okay too. You can do that as long as they are adapted to the soil and can adapt to the climate, and most of them can. Most of the time, if there's a plant that is on a plant list that's not necessarily part of our region, you can plant it if you have the right soil, usually. Again, they benefit and nurture healthy soil environment, which creates healthy soil, creates healthy plants, which creates a healthy environment. And native plants are really beautiful. And I think I meant to put a picture in here and I forgot. So, but I have more pictures ahead. So this is probably a little diagram that you might want to take a picture of, but it's kind of fuzzy. But you can go to the Wisconsin Monarch Collaborative and you can look up these publications that they have. So these are native plants that if you had all of these native plants in your garden, they all bloom at the right time when monarchs are around. You want to make sure that you have common milkweed, swamp milkweed, or some other type of milkweed. Prairie milkweed is good for monarchs to lay eggs on, and then all of these supporting species for nectaring, especially showy goldenrod at the end of the season and New England aster at the end of the season. These two are crucially important for the monarch migration. Okay, this is a picture of my garden, and I believe this is from last year or the year before. In fact, I think it is last year. In this photo, I think just from looking at it briefly, I can see, you know, like 11, 12, 13 native species. And I mix them with other things like the little alliums in the front are not native. The blue balls there are globe thistle, that's not native. There's some hosta over here on the far left, not native, but the hosta that I have, the bumblebees seem to like. So there is nectar in those flowers. You can see some down here, these little orange bags are over seed pods. I collect my own seeds for my garden and grow my own natives. So I think it's really beautiful. I think that this is a wild and I also call it a very fluffy garden because it is fluffy. It's big and it's full. It's very cottagey garden. It fits right in with my architecture of my house, which is a little Cape Cod. So that's what I love about my native garden, is that it's just big and boisterous and beautiful, and it benefits all the native creatures in the neighborhood. And most of these are my photos, except for this common milkweed photo. I just found it. It's just a really beautiful photo. So this is common milkweed. This is New England aster. This is from my garden. Cup plant is a very, very large, tall native plant. So if you have some space, it's a great plant. It's a very good wildlife plant. It provides water for insects and hummingbirds. And whenever this plant starts blooming, then I start seeing tiger swallowtails. They don't seem to come to my garden until this plant is blooming. Black-eyed Susans, I almost never, ever, I always say I never see any insects on black-eyed Susans. Well, I was wrong, because that is my photo. I took that photo. And then Liatris down here on the bottom is a really great plant for native butterflies at the end of the season. They love nectaring off of it. And there's a lot of different species of Liatris. They are all this same color purple, but their flowers are just kind of on the stem in a different configuration, and they have different soil needs. So there's a lot of variety with that plant. Okay. You want to attract beneficial insects to your garden in order to fight off the bad insects, especially if you have a vegetable garden. So that's going to include things that have clusters of small, tiny flowers. So this is slender mountain mint over here. Cosmos is good for bees. And then this one over here on the right side, the yellow one. This is a marigold called Lemon Gem. It's a really old-fashioned marigold. And these kinds of marigolds have the most of that chemical that makes it smell like marigolds. And that is what fights off nematodes in the soil. So having this in a pot is really not benefiting anything except pollinators. If you're trying to fight off nematodes or prevent them, it needs to be in the ground. Goldenrod is great for beneficial insects that are predators of other things. Coneflowers are good for that, for tiny bees. And that's what you're looking for. You're looking to attract tiny bees that are parasitoids of insects insects that you don't want, like tomato hornworm. Have you ever seen a tomato hornworm with the little white things all over its back? Those are the eggs of a parasitoid wasp that is so small you can barely see it. And they like the pollen of things like dill, these little marigolds, slender mountain mint, and goldenrod. Ladybugs also appreciate those kind of plants too. They have tiny flowers but copious amounts of pollen because they eat pollen. So this is 10 of my favorite plants. The first one up is not a native plant, but it is one of my favorite plants, and it has been for many years. I have a whole collection of photos of these plants on my bedroom wall. It's crazy. But this is Oriental Poppy, and this is the variety Brilliant. And it is an enormous flower. It is as big as my hand. If I spread my hand out, it's like a full 5-inch flower. They're absolutely enormous. It is a full perennial, and I've been growing this poppy, I think, since 2014. This is a native plant called coral honeysuckle. If you have the Japanese honeysuckle in your garden, which is the yellow and white flower, which is very, very fragrant, my suggestion to you would be rip it out. I know it's fragrant, I know it's pretty, but it's very, very invasive. And I've had to fight it before in a landscape at my previous job, and it was truly a nightmare. Coral honeysuckle rarely makes seed pods. It's a very, very big, beautiful vine to grow on a fence or a trellis. It's growing in my garden on an arbor that's right up against a fence. And it is an absolute hummingbird magnet. Absolute hummingbird magnet. I love alliums. This is a nice little chart that was put out by a plant nursery that shows all the different alliums there are. The alliums in this photo, in this little illustration, these are all the alliums that you buy as a bulb in the fall. And I find that bees, bumblebees especially, absolutely love alliums. So I have a lot of different alliums in my garden. In fact, some of my alliums, of these alliums that grew by bulbs, some of these have really started to reseed themselves. So I am cleaning some of them out. But here's what some of those other small summer blooming perennial alliums look like. This is Summer Beauty and Millennium, which was Millennium was created at the Chicago Botanic Garden. Here's Pink Jewel. I have one called Pink Planets. And this one over here in the bottom right-hand corner is Nodding Wild Onion, and that is a native. And it's a beautiful little plant in the garden, and I really, really like it. And the bumblebees absolutely go for it. So allium is a great plant if you love bees and you love seeing a lot of different bees. This is what some of my alliums look like in my garden. This is not today. However, some of them are blooming today. And I gotta say, I never see these tall alliums blooming before the 3rd week of May, like after Mother's Day. And so for them to be opening now is bizarre. All right, moving on from alliums to other very, very favorite plants I absolutely love. Coneflower, echinacea. We have milkweeds. There's lots of them. Liatris, again, there's a lot of them. New England aster, one of those critical late season plants. Goldenrod, a critical late season plant. This is not a goldenrod that spreads all over your garden. Joe Pyeweed is beautiful. I love it. It's a magnet for monarch butterflies. Ruellia is a beautiful native plant that's very low, small. Black-eyed Susans are great. So those are like my 10 favorite, but it was really hard to choose. So let's just go over the last part. Brief history of my garden. All kinds of things have happened in my garden. So this is kind of what the garden looked like about a year and a half after I started it. This is 2002, I think. So it was really small and skinny compared to those pictures I showed you. It was just a line. It was just a little line. That plant was, that's a oak leaf hydrangea. I planted it in 2000 and it is still there in my garden. So this is, it went from that little line on the side of the sidewalk to this big thing. So it's 2014. And of course, this is last year. Another cool thing that you can do, I block my alley so people can't see my driveway because that's where I sell my plants. With these big planters, they're pretty beautiful. I have 2 of them. And then let's just wrap up. So, couple of things going on for the summer. There's a lot of things going on in the gardening world this summer in the area. One of the things that I do other than educating is have a tiny, tiny miniature native plant nursery at my house. And so this flyer is for that. My heirloom tomato sale starts on May 15th. My opening weekend for the native plant sale is May 31st. I also sell a few annuals that are good for pollinators. Munster Monarch Festival, which I am the co-chair of, is on September 8th. The East Chicago Monarch Fair, Festival de la Marca, is on September 7th. See if you can visit both. Both worth it, both free. And then we are in Munster, we are doing a 4-part series of lectures on how to incorporate natives into your landscaping. Our last lecture, however, is Healing Gardens and Healing Spaces, where my friend Diane and I talk about the benefits of design on your health, inside and outside of the house. So we're going to do rain gardens, alternatives for banned plants, and native plants for beginners. So take a photo of this or keep an eye out on Facebook for this. But what in the end, my message to you is that urban gardens are really important for pollinators and the environment. So it's important for everybody to have a little garden for their pollinators, and native plants should definitely be part of that. So that's all I have for you. I'm sorry I went over, Amanda. I always do. I'm sorry.
No problem. Thank you, Dolly. We do have some questions in chat. First of all, can you repeat the name of the pruner again?
Felco, Felco.
And then there was another brand somebody was asking about. They typed in Hori Hori, but maybe that's just similar to what you had said.
Yeah, Hori Hori is the Japanese word for the soil knife. Soil knives actually came from Japan.
All right, great. And then we have a question about garlic mustard. Is garlic mustard a native to Indiana?
No, it is an exotic invasive from Europe. And if you have it in your yard or adjacent, it's really important to pull it, and pull it right now before it goes to seed.
Thank you so much, Dolly, for this educational presentation. It was wonderful. We appreciate you taking the time to be with us today.
You're welcome, as always.